Hi, welcome to The Upside. I'm your host, Paul Santino. This is the show where we talk about all the good things that are happening in Long Meadow and the community. Today, I'm privileged to have with me as our guest, Congressman Richard Neal. Congressman, thank you for coming.
Great to be with you, Paul.
I'm dying to just talk to you about a bunch of different things, nothing that have to do with the presidential race. Thank goodness, right? Because we all get our fill on TV. Because one of the things I like to do is in this show is bring things to the public, and one of the things I've always said, people ask is, we can't talk to people above like the selectman or the mayor, because those people are in Washington, they don't matter. But what are the things, because I got a lot of things to ask you, but I want to start off, what are the things that people contact your office for, and what should people know about what a congressman can help someone with?
Well, let me describe the congressional district first. That would be helpful. There are 87 cities and towns.
God bless you.
And it goes from Dudley in the east, all the way to the New York border in the west. To the north it's Vermont, and to the south it's Connecticut. Right. 723,000 people. And we keep a congressional office in Pittsfield, and we of course have a full-time office in Springfield, and we keep a congressional office obviously in Washington. But many of the requests that we have are about Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, health care. And obviously, given the age of the internet, we hear from a lot of diverse opinions about issues that might not ordinarily come up in day-to-day conversations. But I point out to my staff all of the time that people generally don't start by contacting their congressional office. It's sort of a lifeline. It's sort of a last resort. And so I always say to them that the person who is on the other end of the phone, or the person who has written to you, or the person who has emailed to you, they generally are feeling some sense of frustration or indeed desperation, and it's our responsibility to give them some comfort. Even if there are times when we can't resolve the problem, we certainly can provide empathy.
Okay, so if you're getting stuck somewhere, then a good answer may be to call your congressman. Maybe they can help direct you if you can't help them.
That's exactly right. And we have bizarre cases that have come through the congressional office. We have people that trying to contact loved ones from parts of the world that they have not heard from in a long period of time, and we go out of our way to help them with those issues. We have arcane topics that come up from time to time, trying to explain the WEP issue, for example, which is technical in nature. But we also would have day-to-day issues where many people who come through the door, they simply are concerned about a Social Security benefit or a Medicare benefit, and certainly the important role that the VA plays in the lives of the people of Western and Central Massachusetts.
Excellent. So I'm going to do a little history lesson about Congressman Neal, and
sure.
I'm not going to give your resume, but you started out Springfield, born and raised.
Well, actually born in Worcester,
right?
Yeah.
I read that. But,
Worcester.
Yeah, you didn't pick up the accent in those formative years.
That's correct. Yeah.
Technical high school.
Yeah.
Okay.
The technical
high school, which is a call center now, right?
It is a data center.
Data
yes.
center. Okay.
And looks just great, by the way. The facade has been saved, and it's an accomplishment.
And you started out on the city council. What made you? Because I got something I remember reading as a kid about you, and I was a paper boy, so I used to read the paper as I delivered it. So
that's a good habit in life still.
It was, yeah, no, it was, but it was. I learned a lot. Some things I had no idea what they were talking about. But you started out in the city council. What made you get into the fray, so to speak?
Well, I actually saw President Kennedy the day before the election in 1960.
Okay.
My mom was a switchboard operator at the City Hall, and my grandmother took my sisters and I by the hand down to Court Square. And people perhaps forget that Kennedy finished the campaign in Waterbury, Springfield, and Boston the day before. And 24 hours later, he was the president-elect. So I think that there was that sense of guiding aspiration that engulfed me at the time, and that sense of idealism and purpose. And I have not seen that calling in my life diminished at all. I still believe very strongly that there's a role for government. Yeah. And obviously we can argue about the size of government, which we have since the American Revolution and the Civil War, but not to miss the point that there is a balance to be drawn between the public sector and the private sector. We need both. Excellent.
So from Springfield Council to City Council to Mayor. Now I read an article, and this is the one I wanted to ask you. I read an article when you became mayor, and it was quoting some guys you grew up with, and I can't remember the name, but there was they talk about how you guys would play basketball, and someone said, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be this, and your comment, and someone was in the paper quoted saying, Richie said he was going to go be mayor of the city of Springfield. Is that accurate?
That's actually absolutely true, and it was Henry Thomas,
Okay.
who was a teammate of mine from the Sandlots all the way through high school, and he brings that up frequently, and it's entirely truthful. But I also I look at it, and I think that I visited the mayor's office in 1960, and Tom O'Connor was the mayor, and I was mesmerized, and I still have that picture on my wall. It is. It's and it's a great job, by the way. You know, the strong mayor form of government allows you to get a lot of things done when you say they need to be done. A little bit more frustrating in Congress, but not to miss the point that it's still one of the most important jobs in all of Massachusetts. And after Boston, it is the only other city of that size that has a strong mayor form of government.
Yeah. And in your years as mayor, because there's a lot of downtown revitalization going on. I mean, I worked downtown, and there was construction all over the place, the Monarch building, and we were talking about developing potentially in the Civic Center site at that time and so forth. As politicians would like to, see a lot of construction going on in their community because it brings in tax dollars. What was the thought process at that time of trying to rebuild the downtown Springfield area? Because it was fading a little bit.
Well, I think that for commercial purposes, we were trying to regain the footing that we had from perhaps a different era. And retailing clearly is now more focused and concentrated in the suburban communities through the malls, for example. But there are still some pretty good restaurants, and I've had a long-term interest in rehabbing, using the tax credit for rehabbing a lot of the old structures. And at the same time, I was mayor when Monarch Place was built. Those parking decks underneath 91, those were a pretty good piece of land use. And the courthouse is a great achievement in tech. You look at also something that I hope that maybe you'll have a chance to see, and you could take the show there to see it, Paul, and that would be Union Station's going to open in January, at the end of January. And I've spent the better part of 40 years trying to get that done, and it is just about done.
It took a little while.
It took a little while, and it was ironic because we always had the money.
Yeah.
So we were trying to restore and continue to try to restore a part of Springfield's central business district that is important to the quality of life for all the people of Western Mass. It is still the center of finance for Western Massachusetts, and it has, I think, all the challenges that come along with a big city, but not to miss the point that, as was the case with one of the really fine families, the Santinellos, for all of us it was about aspiration, and Springfield gave us a chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as people move to the suburbs, I always try to remind them that we still needed a springboard.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Absolutely.
And it was the city, and by the way, we mixed with each other.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And it was these opportunities to come in contact with people that you might have not shared the same culture with or religion. But you got through the school system, the boys club, the park services and all that. You got to get to know a lot of people. I always think it's akin to the mayor's job as being the conductor of a big orchestra.
Yep.
You've got to make sure that all those instruments are trying to play the same tune.
And obviously, times have changed, and you can't turn the clock back. And I always tell people, I grew up in Springfield. I thought it was one of the best places to grow up. You had neighborhoods. Your neighborhood was your hub, but then you played sports, and then your sports took you out of your neighborhood, and you, like you said, you mixed with everybody and anybody because you were on a team, and typically it wasn't from your neighborhood, so to speak. But and it's changed. I mean, everything changes, but I always have said, as Springfield goes, so goes Longmeadow, East Longmeadow, because if you don't have a strong Springfield, it's kind of hard to have a strong suburban area because the jobs have to be somewhere.
Well, two of the finest employers you're going to find anywhere are Mass Mutual and Bay State Medical Center.
Right.
I mean, they're both headquartered in Springfield.
Right.
And I think that enhancing, strengthening, and encouraging them to grow in Springfield, like the Sisters of Providence at Mercy Hospital, it's a very important consideration in terms of the quality of life and the reputation that the city has. We have this great industrial history. And not to miss the point, we also have the Basketball Hall of Fame. We have a cultural center at the museums and the libraries that are second to none. And I think highlighting those all of the time, and I used to always say to my staff, and they listen to it to this day, in my job with 87 cities and towns, there's a good story in this congressional district every day. Find it. and remind people about it. When I was mayor, that was my attitude. There's a good story in this city every single day. Let's tell people about it.
And it's just, so Springfield you get a reputation, and it does, for you. They never put positive things in the newspaper. And I'm not criticizing the newspaper, but having a good story every day in the city of Springfield isn't going to sell your newspaper.
Well, it's the old story. If it bleeds, it leads.
Right. And but you mentioned the libraries and the museums that we have, and I remember going there as a kid, and then going as an adult, bringing my kids there and saying, you forget that this is in the center of the city, and there are some very positive attributes. When you became mayor, because you said you went into City Hall in 1960, when Tom O'Connor was mayor. When you became mayor, you were elected mayor, what was the very first day you went into your office? What was the first thing that entered your mind?
I wanted to pinch myself, as I did the very first day that I went to the Congress. By and large, even with some differences of opinion that one might have, by and large, the people of Springfield have gotten it right with the people they've selected for the mayor's office. I mean, there are some differences, again, that we might hold, but I think by and large it has had pretty steady leadership over a long period of time. And I know that as I was growing up, there was a great deal of regard that one had in Springfield for the person that we had elected to the highest office. And it was that individual who, in a lot of ways, set the personality of the city and that can-do mentality. The decline of industrialization that has plagued America really began 50 years ago. This notion that all of these old industrial jobs just left yesterday does not square with the truth. I mean, many of those jobs began an out-migration to the south for land, energy costs, and the lack of unions, and then they went offshore. But it was that kind of steady movement, and I was pointing out at an event earlier this morning, it was the hand tool industry at Eastco, where the Sears ratchet was made. Yeah. The Springfield Armory is a good example. The first frozen food. I mean, it's Dr. Seuss's hometown. And visiting the Quadrangle last week, and they're wrapping up their capital campaign, and I certainly would encourage everybody to understand that the Quadrangle is everybody's neighborhood. So support of those institutions is a reminder of how precious they are to the reputation of Western Massachusetts, not just Springfield. So you had to pinch yourself when you go into the mayor's office. Was it everything you thought it was going to be? Well, it's a hard job, I can tell you that. It's sometimes
because it doesn't look too hard. No,
oh God. Sometimes
you made it look easy.
I like to think of it this way. Sometimes for nostalgic purposes, you long for the job.
Yep.
And I was with the firefighters a couple of weeks ago. There were about 500 of them there, and they've been great friends and great supporters. And I said, as they introduced me, I said, I haven't been amongst this many firefighters since you were picketing me when I was mayor. And it brought down the house.
Yeah.
And as I said, there are differences of opinion in the moment, and then you take the long view. So I think that there are great challenges that confront urban America, and I'm ever so hopeful that we can understand that as much as the urban center in America is the apex of achievement, the great orchestras, the great museums, the great libraries, the great centers of commercial and industrial use have been our old cities, but they've frayed. And I think trying to figure out how to make economic equity across Massachusetts find its way to Worcester and to Springfield and to Holyoke, Chicopee, and Pittsfield needs to be part of the discussion as we proceed to the next political season. Boston's doing great, Paul.
Yeah.
And Boston is an international city, but I think it's fair to say that much of that accomplishment and wealth has not made its way through other parts of the state.
Right, and that's, there's always been a disparity between East and West. Huge. It's two different cities, two different attitudes, two different climates. As mayor, you obviously saw that it's harder to get someone to come here to locate a business than it is outside of 128 or something because of all the other connections they have, whether it's for business or transportation or whatever. Is there a way to ever combat that?
Well, I think that part of it is convincing people that you can get a great home out here and a big home, and you can raise a family, and not to miss the point that there's a quality of life out here through the valley. You look at those universities and colleges from Springfield through the hill towns and up through Amherst, South Hadley. I mean, these are colleges that in many ways are the envy of the world. And I think that trying to sell the region on the basis of those opportunities is not just a challenge, but it's something that we never should take our eye off of.
Okay. Very good. So you go from being the big dog on the porch as Mayor of Springfield to a freshman congressman. What was that transition for you, like personally?
It was not helpful to humility.
Yeah.
You go from where everybody's interested in what you think every minute of the day to the idea that, well, maybe they're not quite as interested when you first get to Congress. And I tell a very funny story. When John McCormick was the Speaker of the House from South Boston, he said that he really never spent any time with a freshman member of Congress because you could have been elected by mistake. He said you would not get reelected by mistake.
Okay, very good.
So I think that's part of it, and also, but I think that there's a pecking order in Congress, and you do get better at the job as time goes along. And there clearly comes a point, if one makes it to their 80s or 90s, where they're not quite as accomplished as they were at an earlier stage of life. But I will tell you that just getting them to remember your name when you were a freshman is a bit of a challenge.
That's pretty good. So was part of it being awestruck and seeing some of the people that you know?
I've never lost sight of the fact that I get to go to work in an institution where Mr. Lincoln served. I sit on the same committee, the Ways and Means Committee, that James Madison served on. In my lifetime, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and George Bush Sr. all served in the House of Representatives. And in the history of America, only 12,000 men and women or thereabouts have served in the Congress of the United States. And with some satisfaction, I would say to you this morning that Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama all ran for Congress and got beat.
There you go. So did you remind them of that?
I remind them of that all the time. You have to do it very diplomatically.
Yes. Yes, especially when you're going to negotiate the budget. You want
That's
to make
exactly
sure,
right. I don't want to point out that in their earlier
So how long did it take you to
stretch.
feel comfortable there?
I thought that, I got on the Ways and Means Committee almost immediately. And
That's a pretty big responsibility.
it is of enormous responsibility. Taxes, trade, tariffs, welfare, pensions, parts of Medicaid, and again, Social Security and Medicare. So it's only about 41 of us, very small segment, less than 10% of the Congress serves on the Ways and Means Committee. And the Constitution requires that all revenue measures begin in the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, the House duly looks to the Ways and Means Committee to set the tone. That's where the bill has to originate.
When you're looking at, when you look at it from the outside into Congress, I mean, you see sometimes, you'll see votes on bills, and you don't really see a lot of the dialogue that goes on in between. Is there a mutual respect? Because what we hear, and at least my perception of what I can read in the papers or online, is obviously that the button of heads between Democrats and Republicans. And is it as bad as what we read, or is that only sometimes? Or is it mostly cordial, congenial, political, professional, or?
Collegiality has diminished. There's no question of it. And when I arrived in Congress, we really were friends. And the polarized nature of the modern institution, coupled with 24-hour news, coupled with interest groups, I think, that know just where to put the needle in now, I think it certainly has not been helpful. And the other item that has occurred that's very troubling to me, Congress has more and more crusaders as opposed to legislators. And, let me quote a Republican president. Ronald Reagan always said, if I can get 60 to 70% of what I wanted, you get a deal. We've lost that art form.
Yeah.
We have looked at this now with the idea that we need 100% of everything. And I think that the crusader speaks to the base of the two political parties, where the legislator says, all right, there was an election, now it's time to govern. And I think we've lost touch with the notion of governance because we keep up the talking points. And I also would tell you that I think many of the problems that face America right now are only going to be resolved through bipartisanship. The idea that one side or the other is going to prevail seems very unlikely to me. And I think that when you look at or you survey the big accomplishments in American history, almost all were done in a bipartisan manner. And we need to get back to that.
And the best deal is when everybody feels like they didn't get everything they wanted, right?
Well, I think that's true, coupled with this fact. You can walk out of the room, as I did with collective bargaining, and say, all right, I'm not in love, but I like the product.
Right. Exactly.
And that's what
you
you
didn't
live
get
with.
everything you wanted.
I didn't get what I wanted, but I did okay.
But it was a fair deal.
Yeah, I think that's, by the way, I also think in the private sector that beginning in the late 80s and early 90s, the press began to depict agreements as being a winner and a loser, where there was a time when we all said, all right, we all won. And I think we need to get back to that in America because we're losing sorely.
How do we get back there?
Well, I would hope that
because I don't disagree with you.
I would hope that the public would be more discerning about the people that they elect, to be very candid. And I also would think that, okay, you come back and you've given me all these great talking points and you've given me all of these incendiary arguments and you play to a narrow slice of the American electorate, the base. And then the public, I think, should say, well, what did you get done?
Right.
And a lot of what you get done is complex, hard to explain, but it's not just the fiery issues. It's really day-to-day going into a room and saying, will this ever end? And no, you're back the next day and perhaps back another week. But one of the things that I've always tried to embrace in public life, listen to what the other side's saying. You can listen and then you can discern what it is that they need. And I frequently quote that old sage of American politics, Mick Jagger, when he said, very simply, you might not always get what you want, but you get what you need. And that has always been the bottom line for the negotiating that I've done. But I always try to understand the other person's position. And the last thing you need to do is back them into the corner they can't get out of, because then they flail. And the conversation either gets dangerous or it ends. Instead, you bring them along. You cajole and you convince. And I also think that the press no longer rewards that as an art form.
Right.
That used to be the art form. You know what I mean? You'd come back and say, well, I know that it was hard to explain. You don't have the context of it. But let me tell you what happened. At the end of last year, we did a tax bill, what is known as the PATH Act. 80 Democrats voted for it. And about probably 200 Republicans voted for it. That PATH Act included issues that I've worked on for a career. Making permanent the research and development tax credit, extending new markets tax credits, upping the child care tax credit. All of these things that I perhaps would never have a chance to complete if we didn't do it right at the moment. I know part of my party was against it. Most of my party was against it. And a lot of Republicans were against it. But President Obama was for it and the Republican leadership was for it. I got up and spoke in support of it. I just felt that all of those issues that are likely to improve the quality of life for the American family, they should be embraced. And the easy position would have been for me to say, well, let me take the narrow scope here and oppose these issues because I'm only for perfection as opposed to possibility.
All right. Excellent. So do you think political parties understand, especially in Massachusetts where 54% of the registered voter isn't registered to a political party, do you think that, and I think that's very telling when someone wants to register, because when my kids have registered to vote, they've looked at unenrolled because they don't want to, they see it on TV, right? And they say, I don't want any part of that and I don't want any part of that. And I think that's to your point of, the narrative of, of talking to your base as opposed to talking to the people. And I see that, especially in the young generations coming up, that they don't want to be affiliated with a party.
The independent voter now drives the election in Massachusetts. And they do not like the quarreling. They want solutions. They are concentrated in that 495 Beltway area that I represented for close to 20 years. I got to know them pretty well. They see nothing inconsistent about voting for Bill Weld and Ted Kennedy on the same day.
Right. And that's very different than what you and I may have grown up with, because it was
no question.
It was a party line.
They've arrived in Massachusetts by the tens of thousands, and whether they come to Kendall Square in Cambridge, or whether they come to EMC in Franklin and Hopkinton, or in part of Milford, they don't like at all the polarization of the American political conversation. And the difficulty is that you try to nail down the base and then move it back to the independent voter.
Yep.
And I think that it's clear they don't want to get excited. They want to hear what the proposals are going to be that are going to improve their lives. So right now, you can find that in that Worcester County area, that more and more of the conversation is reflective of what Hopkinton and Milford and places like that want in terms of the state dialogue.
And with that, and like I said, do the parties understand that? I mean, I know everybody goes for the independent voter. I mean, I do know that. Primaries, you go for your base, but then you go for the independent. But do they understand what that means in the sense that people don't want to be affiliated with one side or the other, or labeled?
You will find that when you read and visit the conventions of the two political parties, for example, it tends to be the deep believers, which is great. That's fine. There are certain issues that we all adhere to and we feel very strongly about. But then you have to figure out how to broaden the message and the appeal. But across America today, it really now is the suburban independent voter that decides more and more of these elections. And example, no reason to focus on the presidential campaign, but where is this challenge being met? It's being met in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It's in the suburbs of Des Moines. It's in Columbus, Ohio, because these are voters that are really up for grabs. They're called the persuadables. And you can see everywhere that that's where the candidates attempt to assuage those who might be convinced. As you proceed in the last days of this election, I mean, 93 or 94% of the people have made up their minds, but guess what? 88% had already made up their minds. So now you're down to that 4 or 5%. They really do move from election to election. And in Massachusetts, that is exemplified by the suburbs now, as I've noted earlier, around Boston. It's not, at one time, the turnout in Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Pittsfield, Holyoke, or Chicopee, that would have been the dividing line.
Right.
But now, the turnout is likely to be higher in the suburbs around those communities. So you might have the base, but guess what? There are a lot of people that need to be convinced in those suburban communities. And then the other part of it is the turnout is substantially improved.
Right. It has. Our town will do a presidential race, 90% turnout. That's hard to find in cities and so forth. One of the things I read about you, and I thought it was a pretty neat story, is when you got to Congress, there was a story and a picture of you playing basketball, and I think it was with Jim McMillan, if I got the name right.
Tom
McMillan.
Yeah.
He was a forward or center for the Washington Bullets,
he played in the NBA.
Right? How'd you do against him?
Well, the press would have you believe that I won.
Okay.
The real story is, he played me in bare feet, and he won.
But he was a big guy, though.
He's just about 6'11". I saw him recently at an event I was talking to. I bump into him once in a while in Capitol Hill. He had one of those congressional swing districts in Maryland. So he couldn't always embrace the Democratic positions, and he could never embrace the Republican positions, and eventually he got beat. But he was in Congress, I think, for about 6 years. Really nice guy. I got to like him a heck of a lot more after he no longer played against the Celtics, I can tell you that. Oh, he had the sharpest elbows when he used to play against the Celtics, and he was pretty aggressive, I can tell you that.
So I want to ask you, what's your favorite part of your job?
I think the interaction that I have with other members of Congress, it's a great story about how everybody got there when you consider how few do get there. The example I use is that the chances of playing Major League Baseball for the male is better than your chances of ever winning a seat in the House of Representatives. And for a young female, your chances of playing on the Professional Women's Golf Tour are better than your chances of winning a seat in the Congress. So I take great satisfaction from having been elected all these years, but also the heavy responsibility that you have. There are a few places in life where you cast a vote to send somebody else's child off to war. If you don't take that responsibility seriously, you're in the wrong setting, in the wrong institution. So I do like the give and take. I like talking to people that come from different places. And not to miss the point, as I noted earlier, it is still, in a lot of ways, the great opportunity to discuss the heady issues of the day. And we find the way forward in the crucible of politics, in a representative democracy. And I know how unpopular that sounds right now, but it works. And I think that the public needs, in those instances, to take a deep breath from time to time. Opinions are not facts. And people show up today with their opinions, and they don't square with the facts, but they don't care. And this constant notion that I think that where they're fed this endless cynicism, where now we even tune into media that agree with us.
Right.
I mean, we used to want to hear what Walter Cronkite had to say because it was news. Today, you try to dial up news that agrees with you.
Correct.
And, it's troubling because I think it further divides us as a people. When if there's one thing that we really sorely need right now, it's to be united.
Yep. One of the things that I've always cited about you and your office is that you do constituent services very well. And I was on another show when we were talking about that, and it was during one election cycle. And one story I want to just share with the public is that there's a class from Holyoke that was doing their Washington, D.C. trip. And the teacher was my daughter, who was chaperoning that trip, and I had put them in contact with your office. Because these are, inner city kids, as my daughter said, there's not a lot of traveling in her life going on. And I said, well, call up and find out if you can get the congressman. And she said, all I need is somebody in a suit, because these kids don't see that every day. And it was the day of the wake for Springfield policeman Kevin Ambrose. And I know your schedule really got condensed in Washington because you were coming up for the wake, and that wasn't part of the plan, obviously. And you took the time to address these 40-some-odd kids on the steps of the Capitol. And I understand that Holyoke's in your district, but the reality of 40 young kids, no offense, remember your name a day later, and going home and tell mom and dad, hey, I got the congressman, and you get a million votes out of it. That's not the, but that was important to you to do, and that impressed upon me because that, I don't know what the political affiliation of the kids are, the teacher, and so forth, but that's being a king of constituents. I mean, or responsive to your constituents, and I just wanted to tell you that I respect that very much about what you do, because you do help people. With the position you have, and not every politician does that, but
my staff will tell you I'm obsessed with those moments, and what they think of you in 20 years is what they think of you at that moment. And not to miss the opportunity.
You impressed them, I can tell you that, because they talked about it.
If I'm there, somebody that might even show up from the district that is doesn't have an appointment, but I will always say to the staff, and they say, well, somebody's here from a part of the district, and I will always say, just tell them to be patient. I want to say hello.
Yep.
Come on in, sit down.
But that's important to you.
It's critical.
Yeah.
I think a lot of
but no disrespect, but the longer you serve, you could see how some people might neglect that more and more. And I'm not trying to say you're old or anything, but you've been in there for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I mean that as a big compliment.
Understood. But I do feel that if you really want to kind of curtail some of the geographic or social distance, you just have to spend time with them.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly. Take a couple of questions. I will tell you this, that I still obsess again over news articles. If somebody does something great, let's reinforce it. Yeah. What's the cost in life, Paul, of an affirmation?
Yeah.
Very tiny.
Yeah, very much.
And boy, people need to be affirmed. And if you can use and offer a good word, use and offer the good word.
Yeah. That's excellent, because like I said, I respect that tremendously. I did not because it was my daughter, but if it wasn't.
I had a fellow, a good example of this. I had a fellow who was at a restaurant a couple of years ago, and the fellow said to me, along the same lines, I just walked into the restaurant to meet some old pals that I grew up with, and he said, hey, Congressman, how are you? I said, oh, good, nice to see you. How's everything going? He says, good. I just want to tell you something. He said, I'm the most conservative Republican you're ever going to find, and I always vote for you. I said, well, thank you very much. He said, let me tell you why. He said, I brought my children to Washington. And he said, you made such a big deal out of my family coming to Washington. He said, I overlooked some of the votes I disagree with you on. And I thought, that's what you want.
Right. And that's somehow how you bridge that divide, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
Because you're taking your time out regardless of what their political disposition is.
I'm not too busy for you.
Excellent. That's awesome. Anything else you want to add before we wrap
this has
up?
been terrific, Paul. It's great to see you. As I said, I've known your family for a long time.
Yep.
Between the Chevellis and the Santinellos, they made up half of the South End at one time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them in Longmeadow now. So I served on a board with Bill Chevelli, so it was pretty interesting to see two kids from Springfield. We looked at each other and said, yeah, not bad. Huh?
Not
so,
bad.
I want to thank you for coming in. Truly, because I know your schedule is very, very busy. It took a lot of time to get this to set up because I know you're so busy. So, folks, if you ever have questions, like Congressman said early in the interview about you're at the end of the rope and you need some help, call his office. I know personally they're there to respond to you. So, Congressman, again, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Upside. Have a great day.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.